Imagine falling from 6 kilometers up, without a parachute, for 15 minutes, inside the severed tail of a bomber, and then standing up and walking away. It sounds like Hollywood, doesn't it? But it really happened. On January 11, 1944, over occupied Greece, Sergeant James Raley survived something that should have killed him. When two B-17 bombers collided in the clouds, the tail section of his plane, a 12-meter chunk with him still inside, broke off and began to plummet. Trapped among machine guns and ammunition, with no way to reach his parachute, Raley had only his thoughts and 10 minutes until impact. "If I was going to die, I just wanted to get it over with," he later said. But death had other plans that day. This is the story of the greatest survival miracle of World War II. Before James Raley fell from the sky, he was just an ordinary boy from Kentucky. Born on May 25, 1916, in Henderson, he was the 8th of 9 children in a farming family. Life during the Great Depression wasn't easy. Hard labor on the farm, few prospects, and too many mouths to feed. In 1935, at just 19, young Raley made a decision that would change his life. He enlisted in the U.S. Army. That was 4 years before war broke out in Europe, 6 years before Pearl Harbor. When the war finally came, Raley was already a seasoned soldier. He served with the 1st Armored Division in the North African Campaign, fighting through Tunisia's desert storms against Rommel's Afrika Korps. In May 1943, he witnessed the surrender of 250,000 German and Italian troops. The war in Africa was won, but for Raley it was only just beginning. After the German surrender in Tunisia came boredom. Raley, used to action, wrote to his brother, "Life is too quiet." Imagine that. You've survived the hell of the desert, German shelling, tank battles, and now you're sitting in camp, filling out paperwork. That wasn't for him. In 1943, Raley made a decision that sounded like madness. He volunteered for the Army Air Forces, not as a pilot, as the tail gunner of a B-17 bomber. It was the most dangerous position on the entire crew, the highest casualty rate. Every mission could be your last. But Raley was thrilled. In a letter to his family, he wrote, "I traded my typewriter for 2 beautiful guns." He was assigned to the 302nd Bomb Squadron, 301st Bomb Group, 15th Air Force, stationed in Italy. His new home? The 12-meter tail of a flying fortress. His new job? Protect the bomber from German fighters. His chances of survival? Don't ask. The B-17 Flying Fortress. The name sounds impressive, doesn't it? 10 machine guns, armor plating, 14,000 kilograms of bombs. But if you were the tail gunner, the fortress was a death trap. Raley's position was in a completely isolated 12-meter tail section of the aircraft. You entered through a small hatch, crawled into a cramped metal shell, and stayed there, alone, for the entire mission. In front of you, 2.50 caliber machine guns. Around you, hundreds of rounds of ammunition. And here's the problem. In that tiny space, you couldn't wear a parachute. It was too big, too cumbersome. So what did they do? The parachute was kept beside you, hooked to a latch. If the bomber got hit, you were supposed to crawl back into the fuselage, strap it on, and jump. In theory. In practice? Tail gunners had the highest mortality rate of the entire crew. When German fighters attacked, they came from behind. And you were the first target. James Raley knew all of this, and he chose the job anyway, because he loved to fly. On January 11, 1944, 21 B-17 bombers took off from their base in Italy, heading north. Their target, the port of Piraeus in Athens, occupied Greece. It was a key German transport hub in the Balkans, fuel depots, ammunition stores, supply ships. Destroy Piraeus and you cripple the enemy's logistics. The mission seemed routine. The formation was divided into 4 squadrons, escorted by fast P-38 Lightning fighters. B-17 number 42-3098, nicknamed Skippy, led the second squadron. On board were 10 crew members: pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, flight engineer, radio operator, and gunners, all in their positions. And in the tail, completely isolated from the rest, sat Sergeant James Raley. He checked his guns, adjusted his sights, loaded the ammunition. Standard pre-mission routine. He had no idea that in a few hours he would be falling through the sky without a parachute, that he would be the only man from the entire crew to survive, that he would become a legend. Over Greece, the sky turned into a trap. Thick gray clouds wrapped around the entire formation like a shroud of death. Visibility? Zero. Pilots could see only the very tips of their own wings. The rest, white fog. It was a nightmare for 21 bombers flying in tight formation. One mistake, one careless move, and disaster could strike. Safety protocol was clear. The rear squadrons were to fly off course for 2 minutes to create a safe distance. But it was already too late. The weather was impossible. Commanders decided, climb higher, above the clouds, where visibility would be better. The bombers began to rise. And then, something no one could have foreseen. Higher up in the same airspace flew another formation, the 97th Bomb Group, returning from their own mission. They too were trying to escape the clouds. They too were climbing. 2 formations of B-17s, each weighing 15 tons, each traveling at 300 kilometers per hour, were flying directly toward each other, blind, in a white fog. The collision was inevitable. A hellish jolt. That's how James Raley described the moment. In a fraction of a second, his world exploded. 2 B-17s from the 97th Bomb Group burst out of the clouds straight into the formation of the 301st. Metal struck metal at 600 kilometers per hour. Wings tore away like paper. Fuselages shattered into pieces. The bombers turned into flying coffins. And then came chaos. 8 B-17 flying fortresses, each worth $300,000, each carrying 10 men, began to fall through the clouds. Wreckage, shards of metal, engines, bodies, all spinning in a deadly dance. Skippy was caught in the middle of the carnage. Something, perhaps the wing of another bomber, perhaps a chunk of fuselage, smashed into her tail with unimaginable force. The 12-meter tail section, with James Raley still inside, tore away from the rest of the plane, and it began to fall. Raley was trapped among the guns and ammunition, inside a metal shell hurtling toward the earth. He couldn't move. He couldn't reach his parachute. All he could do was wait for death. I knew we were spinning. Blue, green, brown flashes went by. James Raley was fully conscious, watching his own death in slow motion. Blue, that was the sky. Green, the Greek mountains. Brown, the ground that was about to kill him. And the worst part? Raley thought the whole plane was still intact. He felt the jolt. He felt the fall. But he didn't see the destruction. Trapped in the tail, with no window into the fuselage, he had no idea he was flying alone inside a severed fragment. He believed the pilot was trying to regain control, that maybe somehow they'd pull the bomber out of the dive. But the spinning didn't stop. Blue, green, brown, blue, green, brown. The rotation was so violent that centrifugal force pinned him to the wall. He couldn't move, even if he wanted to. Images flashed through his mind. The farm in Kentucky, his 8 siblings, his parents, the deserts of Tunisia. He prayed. In a few minutes, I'll be dead. And then he started counting. 1 minute, 2, 5, 10. Why is this taking so long? And then, crash. The world exploded in the sound of splintering wood and crushed metal. The tail slammed into a cluster of pine trees on the slope of a Greek mountain. The trees, growing densely one beside another, snapped under the impact, but not all at once. Each tree slowed the fall by a few percent. The first broke, transferring energy to the next, then the second, the third, the fifth, the 10th. Like a natural crumple zone on a car, the pines absorbed the kinetic energy of the fall. And then, silence. James Raley opened his eyes. He was alive. Number. That wasn't possible. But he was alive. Trapped inside the wreckage, he began to crawl out. The emergency exit was jammed, so he wriggled toward the main hatch. He pushed himself through and slid outside. And then, for the first time, he saw the truth. There was no airplane, no fuselage, no wings, only the tail, a 12-meter hunk of twisted metal crushed among the broken pines. He had fallen nearly 6 kilometers, without a parachute. And he checked his body. His back hurt, probably a spinal injury. His chin was bleeding, a small cut, bruises on his legs. That was all. The man who had fallen 6 kilometers, who should have been nothing but a smear on the rocks, was standing and walking. This wasn't luck, it was a miracle. James Raley stood on the side of a Greek mountain and realized the terrifying truth. He was alone, on enemy territory. January 1944. Greece had been under German occupation for 3 years. The Wehrmacht patrolled the villages. The Gestapo hunted saboteurs. Executions were routine. And him? An American airman. His uniform torn to shreds, injured, disoriented. If the Germans found him, he'd end up in a POW camp, or worse. He tried to move. His chest burned with every breath. Maybe a broken rib? His back injury made walking difficult. He didn't know how serious his wounds were. He might be bleeding internally. He might die within the hour. But he couldn't stay there. He began to pick his way carefully from tree to tree across the steep, rocky slope. Every step was agony. After several minutes, he found a narrow path and sat down, gasping in pain. Then the rain began. Cold January rain soaked through his torn uniform. Soaked, injured, alone on enemy ground, 6,000 kilometers from home. And then he heard voices, men's voices, speaking Greek, getting closer. Raley had 2 options, hide or take a risk. He chose the risk. He called out. The voices went silent, then answered, speaking Greek. Within minutes, several men in dark robes appeared on the trail, Orthodox monks. They looked at the wounded American airman with a mix of compassion and determination. Without a word, Raley didn't speak Greek, and they didn't speak English. They helped him to his feet and began guiding him up the mountainside. The monastery, hidden deep in the mountains, was part of a rescue network for Allied airmen. Despite the brutal occupation, Greeks risked everything to protect the Allies. Being caught sheltering an Allied soldier meant execution for the entire village. But the monks didn't hesitate. They led Raley to a small stone building where someone was already waiting. Second Lieutenant Neil Daly, who had also fallen during the same mid-air collision. Daly had been lucky. He'd managed to strap on his parachute, though it had torn partially during the descent. When he saw Raley, he was speechless. He was like a madman, Daly later recalled. He kept saying, "I have to tell someone what happened to me." He fell without a parachute. A local village doctor treated their injuries. They were safe for now. What happened on January 11, 1944, over Greece, was one of the worst air disasters of World War II. 8 destroyed B-17 flying fortresses. Each bomber cost $300,000, about $2.5 million in today's money. But that wasn't the greatest cost. 64 airmen killed, 64 young men who never came home, 64 letters to families beginning with the words, "We regret to inform you." Out of 8 destroyed bombers, 80 crewmen, only 17 survived. And of those 17, only 1 had fallen without a parachute. James Raley was the only human being to survive a fall like that. The entire 10-man crew of Skippy was dead. The pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier, every gunner, all gone, all except him. Why? Why did the tail hit the pine trees? Why did the spin slow the fall just enough for the trees to catch him? Why him and not one of the other 9? Questions without answers. But now, safe in the monastery, Raley had a new problem. He was in occupied Greece, and somehow he had to escape. January, February, March, April. Nearly 3 months. James Raley spent almost 3 months hiding in occupied Greece. It wasn't like the movies. There were no dramatic escapes, no heroic skirmishes. There was only boredom, fear, and constant vigilance. Greece in 1944 was hell. Triple occupied by the Germans in the north, the Italians on the islands, the Bulgarians in the east. The Wehrmacht controlled the cities and main roads. Greek partisans, mainly ELAS, a leftist resistance organization, controlled the mountains and villages. It was like a game of chess where every move could mean death. Monks and local partisans organized shelter for Raley and other Allied airmen. They moved at night, hiding in caves and abandoned buildings. German soldiers patrolled regularly. Sometimes you could hear their voices on a trail just a meter from your hiding place. One cough, one stumble, one wrong move, and it was over. Raley lived in constant tension. Every sound could be the end. Every day could be the last. But Greek civilians risked everything to protect him. To understand what James Raley endured, you need to understand Greece in 1944. It was one of the most devastated places in all of Europe. Since 1941, the year of the German invasion, 500,000 Greeks had died. 7% of the entire population. From famine, disease, executions. The Germans ruthlessly exploited the country, taking food, fuel, and raw materials, leaving the population to starve. Elas, the communist Greek resistance movement, controlled most rural areas. 25,000 armed fighters waged guerrilla warfare against the occupiers. They sabotaged rail lines, attacked patrols, rescued Allied personnel. British and American special missions operated in the mountains, coordinating the resistance and preparing the ground for a future invasion. Because the Allies were planning a landing in the Balkans. And the Germans? They were slowly beginning to retreat, knowing they were losing the war. But they were still there, and they were still dangerous. James Raley had to survive in this chaos long enough to be evacuated, if anyone came at all. Mid-March 1944, 2 months after the crash, news arrived. The British Greek Rescue Network had contacted the monastery. There was a chance for evacuation. Raley left the monastery 2 weeks after the fall, on crutches, still in pain, but alive. Together with other surviving airmen, including 2nd Lieutenant Daly, he was guided through the mountains along secret paths. This was the riskiest part of the entire escape. Every route could be patrolled by Germans. Every village could harbor a traitor. One tip-off, and everyone would be dead, including the Greeks who were helping them. Night marches, days spent hiding in the forests, eating barely enough to survive. But the Greek guides knew every rock, every cave, every hiding place. They led the Allies cautiously, gradually, systematically. By early April, James Raley reached a safe zone. He was evacuated from Greece, probably by submarine or along the southern coast, to an Allied base in Italy. Against all odds, against all predictions, the man who fell 6 kilometers without a parachute returned to his unit, alive. April 14, 1944, exactly 3 months after the crash, James Raley's story exploded in the American press like a bomb. The Associated Press published a first-hand account with a photograph, a young sergeant, and next to him a nurse tending a small cut on his chin. That was his only visible injury. The man who had fallen nearly 6 kilometers had a scratch on his chin. Raley's quote spread across America. "If I were going to die, I wanted to get it over with." Cold calm, the fatalism of a soldier who had accepted death and been reborn. The story was everywhere. Every newspaper wanted details. Henderson, Kentucky, Raley's hometown, exploded with pride. Local papers ran special editions. "Our boy survived the impossible." The military initially did not want to release details. Information about bomber losses was classified. But this story was too good, too powerful to hide. America needed heroes in 1944. The war had been going on for almost 3 years. People were tired. And James Raley? He was living proof that miracles happen. Most people, after surviving something like that, would have said, "Enough." They would have requested transfer to a safer unit. Or a medical discharge? No one would have questioned it. Fell 6 kilometers without a parachute? Of course you have PTSD. Of course you need rest. But not James Raley. The man who stared death in the face for 10 minutes, who survived the impossible, returned as a B-17 tail gunner to the same position that had almost killed him. Officers in his unit recalled he loved being a tail gunner. It wasn't a duty. It was a passion. Escaping death didn't scare him. It motivated him. Raley received the Air Medal for combat bravery and a bronze oak leaf cluster for subsequent missions. He continued flying bombing missions over Europe until the end of the war in 1945. How many times did he sit in that tail, looking through the gun sight, remembering that January day? How many times did he hear the message, "Enemy fighters, 12 o'clock," and feel the adrenaline? How many times did he think, "I've already survived the impossible"? He never complained. He never requested a transfer. He was a soldier, and that defined him. 1945. The war in Europe was ending. James Raley returned to America as a hero, but with a burden. He was the only survivor of the Skippy disaster. 9 other crew members had not lived. 9 families without fathers, sons, brothers. And Raley made a decision that revealed his character. He visited all 9 families, one by one. He told them about the final moments of their loved ones, that they had been brave, that they had died quickly, that they hadn't suffered. Lies, perhaps some, but necessary. These families needed closure, and Raley felt he owed it to them. And there, in one of those homes, he met Lorraine Lynberry Sudall, the widow of Skippy's second pilot, Second Lieutenant Henry J. Sudall. Memory connected them. Grief, understanding, and love. They married. They lived in Atlanta, Georgia. Lorraine already knew what it meant to be the wife of an airman. She understood the fear, the waiting, the uncertainty. And Raley had found someone who understood his pain. They shared the memory of the crew, of the men who died, of the day that changed everything. But Raley's service was not over. He stayed in the military, because it was his life. Korea, 1950. The Cold War turns hot, and James Raley is back in the air. The man who fell 6 kilometers without a parachute is flying combat missions again, this time over the Korean peninsula. Was he afraid? Surely. But fear never stopped him. He rose through the ranks. His experience with Skippy made him a legend among younger pilots. "That's the guy," they whispered, "the one who survived the impossible." But Raley didn't live in the past. He focused on the mission, on the men under his command, on getting them home. Korea ends, but Raley stays, because it wasn't just a job. It was a calling. Vietnam, 1965. Raley is 50 years old. Most men his age think of retirement. He thinks of the next mission. He is promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, United States Air Force. 3 wars, tens, maybe hundreds of combat missions. And it all began with that one jump, without a parachute, without a chance. But he survived, and he continued to serve. For more than 30 years in uniform. Finally, retirement comes, with full honors, with the respect of the entire Air Force. And when his time comes, he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery, among America's greatest heroes. 1999. James Andrew Raley dies at the age of 83. He lived longer than anyone could have expected. especially after what happened in 1945. But the story of Skippy remained a secret for decades. Only in 1973, 29 years after the crash, was it declassified. Raley wrote an autobiography, I Fell 4 Miles and Lived, World War II, Missing in Action. 4 miles, that's what the title said. But the truth was even crazier. 19,000 feet, nearly 6 kilometers, 5,791 meters, to be exact. 10, maybe 15 minutes in the air, falling, spinning, dying. And truly, the physics of that miracle are incredible. The B-17 tail spun like a leaf. Weight distribution perfect. Raley in the middle, metal around him. Air resistance slowed the fall enough. And the pines, those cursed pines in Alsace, his salvation. They cushioned the impact in the final critical second. So what was it? Luck? A miracle? Divine intervention? Raley never knew for sure. Maybe all of it at once. But one thing is certain. James Andrew Raley, the man who fell from the sky and returned to fight.